you very much for coming. The idea of this research seminar really emerged from a conversation I had with Maria Burke, which is that really we should think about doing something on Brexit, given the expertise that we have in BLS, particularly within the law department. As my research is generally on constitutional law, politics and parliament, then I've been following Brexit extremely closely, really for many years, really, sort of long before we really had the referendum, because it's my view that this has been a long time coming. It's been my view that there are long and short-term reasons for coming, and I'm going to explore that briefly, and then I'll discuss the case that's going on before the Supreme Court right now. So this is what I hope to do, and I think my first point is, I apologise if there's been any false advertising, because in the advert it did suggest that I might look at the Great Repeal Bill and the outline of the negotiations. By all means ask questions about those if you want to, but in the 30 minutes I've got, I'm unlikely to have time to sort of cover those, because the Article 50 litigation has had ever more dimensions crafted onto it since I've agreed to do this research seminar. So this has become a black hole from which there can be possibly no return, but I'll come back to that. Or maybe it's not a black hole at all, but we'll see. So the first thing is, what caused the result? Because the referendum is, I think, the result of the referendum is the biggest political shock, I think, definitely since Clement Attlee won the 1945 general election, possibly since the time we had any form of modern democracy from the Great Reform Act 1832. It is a massive constitutional shock to the country, both politically and legally. And I think there are a range of sort of long-term reasons for this. Firstly, that the EU was never Britain's idea in the first place. Firstly, that Britain declined to be one of the founding member states of the EU. And so that meant that when it came to developing the institutions of the EU, Britain didn't have an input. And so this meant that the institutions of the EU went off in a direction that I think has never been to the entire satisfaction of British politicians from both of the main parties. And I feel that in the Treaty of Rome there is this commitment to ever closer union. And I simply cannot believe that if the UK was there as a negotiating party to the original Treaty of Rome, ever closer union would have been in the Treaty of Rome. And I think you can draw a parallel with the Council of Europe, which the UK had a far greater role in creating, which was focused on intergovernmental relations in general. It's far more of a standard intergovernmental body. And so the way the EEC was set up, I think from the very start, is very sort of never been to the satisfaction of the UK. It's also the case that Britain did sort of decide, perhaps rather late, to join the party. They decided twice, in 1962 and 68, to apply for membership. But Charles de Gaulle, President of France at the time, said no, and said no twice. And on the first time he said no, in 1962, he summed up England, meaning Britain as a whole, as follows. That England, in effect, is insular. She is maritime, she is linked through her exchanges, her markets, her supply lines to the most diverse and often the most distant countries. She pursues essentially industrial and commercial activities and only slight agricultural ones. She has in all her doings very marked and very original habits and traditions. I think sometimes it may take someone from overseas to explain your own country better than you can. And I think it's de Gaulle there sums up why neither British main political party in Britain showed a settled consensus about Britain's membership of the EU. At the times when Labour was strongly in favour of membership of the EU or favouring Britain's role in Europe, the Conservatives were against, sort of during the 1990s and the Blair years. At the time when the Conservatives were most in favour of Britain's role in Europe and favouring it, say, the 1970s, Labour were against, or at the very least, massively divided between themselves internally. And so there's never, Britain's membership of the EU or EEC, whatever it was at a particular time, has always been a massively controversial issue. And that has rolled on, I think, ever since Britain joined. And I think the sort of first fracturing of Britain's membership of the EU actually came in the Maastricht Treaty, because this was the treaty that set in motion the creation for the euro. Sort of the preparations had been made in the 1970s, but this was the treaty that set the euro as a commitment. And this was the first time, in a significant sense, Britain opted to say, this isn't for us. And what's more, other member states that wanted to pursue the euro didn't really understand why Britain didn't want to join. And although Major got the opt-out when negotiating in the European Council, it was actually Helmut Kohl in the European Council meetings who assisted John Major to do this. Helmut Kohl was the German Chancellor at the time. And he, in the European Council meeting, said to the other member states, said, look, John needs this, and if you don't give him the opt-out, you won't get a euro, because he could never agree to this treaty. And the negotiations really did get that front. And I think the great irony about the Maastricht Treaty is that even though it created the European Union, it began the fracturing of the union of the member states, in that they weren't, from that point on, all sort of following the same direction. And shortly after this, we had the economic debacle of the exchange rate mechanism and Black Wednesday, which I think had a profound psychological effect on the Conservative Party. And I think that was felt sort of even to this day amongst Conservative backbenchers. For those of you who don't know, the exchange rate mechanism was enacted to prepare for the euro, to sort of stabilise currencies and sort of help equalise them. So then when the transition to the euro was made, that process was meant to be sort of smoother. Britain decided to take part in the ERM with the aim of sort of more stable inflation and a more stable pound. However, it didn't work like that for Britain, because Britain entered at the wrong level. And speculators ultimately caused, George Soros, for example, made sort of about £1.3 billion on Black Wednesday, which is when the pound dropped out of the exchange rate mechanism. Exchange rates changed 5 times in 24 hours, from 10 to 12 to 15%. Those numbers are extraordinary in and of themselves today, but then back down from 15 to 12 to 10%. And this caused an immediate recession, completely obliterated the Conservatives' reputation for economic competence for the next 10 years, possibly until Cameron became party leader, who made a real break with the past. It really had a most profound effect on the Conservatives. And there was 2 things, I think. Firstly, it meant that more Europe was not necessarily good. The other thing is that actually leaving a European notion such as the ERM could actually be a good thing, because once Britain left the ERM, actually the economy performed extremely well once it recovered from the immediate recession, and Blair inherited quite a good set of economic conditions in 1997, which he continued on for a good while afterwards. And so this is really, the ERM was really when Euroscepticism came to the fore. And with the developments in the EU since then, it's all been building on from this starting point. And that leads to sort of 2 short-term reasons for the result in particular, because I think the long-term reasons are perhaps reasons for the referendum. And there are many more. I'm summarising here, so perhaps some of the key political elements. The short-term reasons for the result, in particular, one is immigration. And these are, it's taken from, I will admit, it's taken from Migration Watch's website, but it's using data from the ONS, which I've double-checked. And you can see here that one of the problems, or perceived problems, is the level of immigration really from this point onwards. Immigration was never a political issue during this time. This is just EU immigration. The next slide shows immigration from all nationalities. And in particular, this black line shows what's known as the EU8 immigrants, which is those 8 countries that joined the EU in 2004, but doesn't include Cyprus and Malta, because they're considered under total EU net migration. This is the ONS classification as well. The idea of excluding Malta and Cyprus is that their incomes are on a par with existing EU member states. So their figures are included here. The other countries that joined the EU in 2004 generally had significantly lower income per capita, and so these statisticians make a sort of this separate category. And the issue is that the UK was the only major country in the EU not to implement transitional controls on immigration from the new member states from 2004. And you can see instantly that the level of immigration was higher than before. Now, you might say that immigration is a good thing or a bad thing, but if you think that immigration is a bad thing, then this is the reason why. Because it's historically high levels of immigration, and this has continued since that point with sort of various, peaks and troughs. And even today, sort of now it becomes sort of significantly higher still. I don't want to make this a seminar on immigration statistics, but that's the basic point. Now, just to show you immigration as a whole, so this includes EU and non-EU immigration, you can see that EU immigration is about half of the story today. But you can still see that in historical terms, we're going for an unprecedented period of high immigration. And I think the failure is not necessarily immigration itself, but I don't think we've had an adequate policy response to that, to deal with the consequences of that on housing, on health, and public services, and what have you. May contribute, but there are some challenges that this raises, and I don't think the government of all colours, Labour, Conservative, and Coalition, have really adequately dealt with some of those challenges. And I think that has been the flashpoint. And a vote for leaving was a vote perhaps for trying to deal with at least half of the problem, in some views. The more immediate thing was the nature of the campaigns. And this is where I do get a little bit more legal. So if you're wondering why I'm from the law department, this is where I get a little bit more legal. There you have the two sort of main slogans in a nutshell. I think this is by far the most interesting, because Vote Leave had a very simple refrain: take back control. As a matter of political communication, I think that was fantastic, because it summed up their arguments brilliantly, whether you agree with them or not. But it summed up their arguments brilliantly. Take back control means take back control of sovereignty, take back control of immigration, take back control of your laws. It's summed up in 3 words, or 4 words, what their campaign was about. By contrast, I'm in from the Britain Stronger in Europe campaign, and the name there sort of gives you a clue. It's designed by committee, I think, rather than sort of a more substantial sort of, didn't have the same level of dynamism. Just doesn't have the same purchase about it, sort of politically. And particularly perhaps when combined with the nature of the Remain campaign, which was to sort of make this idea of shock of sort of project fear again, as sort of saying that if you voted to leave, all these negative consequences would happen. And that's sort of saying, well, I'm in because I know what's best, and you should do too, and if you disagree with me, then you're wrong. It's a sort of the phrasing of it's not very nice and positive. It didn't really make a positive case for staying in the EU. The legal point is, was this a lie? £350 million a week. And really what's interesting is that the same campaign team that ran Vote Leave also ran that campaign, the No to AV campaign, where they used exactly the same tactics and said, vote no because we can't afford it, and they made up a similarly vacuous figure of £250 million. There's sort of, that was stretching the truth, I think, even more than the £350 million figure from that campaign. But the point is that they knew what the regulations of the referendum allowed. And that unlike in elections, referendums have no control whatsoever over campaign material. Whereas, as Phil Willis, the former MP for Oldham East and Saddleworth, found out to his cost, there are provisions in election law where you cannot make false statements about another candidate under Section 106 of the Representation of the People's Act 1983. And if you do, then your election is void and you're not allowed to stand in the by-election and you commit a criminal offence. There are no such controls with referendums. And again, I think this is a problem that, in some ways, it put the Remain campaign in a very difficult situation, because if they said, well, it's not 350 million, it's 180 million, well, it's like, that still sounds like an awful lot of money to many people. Sort of, in terms of public spending, it sort of may not be, but if you say, well, it's 180 million, not 350, well, it's sort of, and then, on the other hand, if you say, well, you're lying, again, that's possibly not the best situation to be in. And again, you're making arguments over process rather than arguments over substance. So it's a very sort of clever device used, knowing the framework of the referendums. Also, interestingly, the bus is coloured in Labour red to confuse the message even more. And I know Matthew Elliott, who ran the Leave campaign, did that deliberately. So that's very interesting, and that's, I think, for future referendums, this is something that's got to be looked at, because this has happened twice. It's also the case that Chukramuna has said that if you're from, representing the Remain campaign, a future referendum, you've got to think of different ways to campaign, because this model of campaigning has not worked. It's certainly my view that I think Remain lost the referendum rather than Leave winning it. I think overall, I think we're sort of... so, that's the politics. Now for some more law. Although, perhaps I should have a photograph of the Supreme Court rather than, I'm saying that's law, but then sort of, but we'll see what I mean in a moment. Because we've got the most bizarre case, I think, before the Supreme Court right now. Because it's a case that's meant to be about Brexit. But it's not about Brexit. It's sort of, and I'll explain why. The arguments I'm sure you've heard, because the coverage has been fairly blanketed to the extent that Sky News are holding pre-match analysis and their match of the day highlights in the evening, and showing the whole thing live, is that the argument of Miller and Dos Santos, and I'll make a distinction here, there are two elements of the case. There's the Miller and Dos Santos element about Article 50, and then there is the element of devolution. And if I have time, I'll do devolution. We'll see how we go. The Miller and Dos Santos element's the most important. Their argument is that Article 50 cannot be invoked by the government using the royal prerogative. And that's because if you invoke Article 50, then it necessarily follows that rights that have been part of UK law, via the European Communities Act 1972, are taken away. And that's because under Article 50 itself, it says that if you make the notification under paragraph 2, after 2 years the treaties cease to apply to the member state that made the notification. And so that means that the actual act that takes the rights away is making the notification. And if you do that under the royal prerogative, then it's the royal prerogative that are taking those rights that are derived from European law but part of UK law, those rights are being taken away. And they're being taken away by the royal prerogative. And it's a fairly standard constitutional law principle, according to the claimants, that you can't do that using the royal prerogative. Because that would make the European Communities Act 1972 a dead letter. It wouldn't have any substantive content. It'd still be on the statute book, but it wouldn't have any substantive content. And using the Fire Brigades case from 1991, I won't go into great detail about that, that's not allowed. And that an act of Parliament is required to authorise the government to invoke Article 50, because it is the later Act of Parliament that authorises it, and that can override what the 1972 Act. If there were any sort of implied restrictions in the 72 Act, a later Act would clarify that and say, no, that's fine, you've got express authorisation to do it. The government's argument is a fairly standard constitutional law argument based on the nature of the prerogative. The royal prerogative is that collection of powers that the government has that are derived from times when sort of monarchs not only reigned, but also ruled, and in some cases personally ruled. But it was established after the constitutional upheavals of the 17th century, the case of proclamations and the Bill of Rights, that the position is now that Parliament can either replace the prerogative or regulate how the prerogative is exercised, which is usually what happens. And the argument of the government is that the royal prerogative to invoke Article 50 is untouched, as that's part of the prerogative to conduct international relations, in particular the power to negotiate, ratify and withdraw from treaties. Government has the power to withdraw from international treaties and has done so in the past. There are controls on the prerogative power enacted by Parliament, but none of these touch Article 50. The ratification of treaties is subject to a procedure in the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010, and the European Union Act 2011 provides for a very elaborate scheme of either parliamentary consent or a referendum to make various amendments to the EU treaties, which is the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union and the Treaty on European Union. So consequently the argument of the government is that the royal prerogative is untouched, and so the government can exercise the prerogative to invoke Article 50. As to which side will win in the Supreme Court, I think, well, and if I'm a betting man, and I suppose I am a little bit, and you can bet on the case with that, and the odds actually on the government winning have lengthened, and I think that's probably telling you how the case is going for the government. I think it's unlikely that the government will win. I think it's likely to be a split decision, sort of make it sound more like a boxing match, I suppose, but sort of split decision. I sort of thought maybe 7-4. Maybe that might drift to 9-2, I think, or something like that. But I do think the High Court dismissed the government's arguments far too readily in their case. I think they dismissed their arguments far too readily. They deserve far more of a detailed and forensic look than they received in the High Court. So, okay, so I'll finish up with the point. So why do I say none of this is about Brexit? Which might be the point that's baffling you. Because the thing that's bothering me most is that I'm not sure what Miller and Dos Santos, the claimants and their funders, more importantly, are trying to achieve. Because if they win, then the government needs to pass a bill through there, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And if they do that, they could pass a very, very short bill that just authorises them to do it, the government to do it. It's not going to stop Brexit in any way, shape or form. And if it's just a very, very short bill, then although the sort of source of the power to invoke Article 50 changes, the substance doesn't. And the division between what the government has as a source of statutory power and a source of prerogative power is at times extremely arbitrary. And it doesn't necessarily have as profound impact as it first may appear. And so you have to sort of think, well, what else were they trying to achieve? Maybe they were believing that the House of Commons or the House of Lords may vote against any such bill. And that might have been the thought in the immediate aftermath of the referendum. But the view, particularly in the House of Commons, has shifted. I think the politics has moved faster than the legal process here, where estimates suggest that you may get around 70 to 80 MPs voting against an Article 50 bill. Like to be the SNP, the Lib Dems, few Labour voters, and Ken Clarke. And, you know, so the issue is, could they amend the bill in ways that the government don't like? Government does have a small majority, but it is larger than it first may appear. They have the benefit of the Democratic Unionist Party from Northern Ireland. They have the benefit that the 4 Sinn Féin MPs from Northern Ireland don't take the seat and play any role in the legislative functions of the House of Commons. The Ulster Unionists will they have 2 MPs who are likely to vote in favour of the government, and Douglas Carswell of UKIP is likely to vote with the government. So the government's majority of 13 becomes a majority of 28. And that's even without Labour MPs, the Giesler Stewarts of this world, wanting to get on with Brexit as fast as possible. So the idea that there could be any significant amendments that the government doesn't like on an Article 50 bill, I think, are quite slim. Issue is the House of Lords. And the House of Lords, they were more strongly in favour of Remain before the referendum, but even there, the argument has moved on. I think in terms of any Article 50 bill, I think they might be emboldened if the government on these sides of these benches have to descend to procedural shenanigans to curtail debate here to prevent any amendments coming through. Because what the government can do, they could pass a programme motion limiting the amount of time spent on debate on any Article 50 bill, or they could even pass a guillotine motion saying, right, we've got 1 more hour of debate at certain stages of the legislative process. If it gets to that point, then the House of Lords are likely to put more amendments in and force the government to vote, the House of Commons to vote on those issues. So there could be a little bit of ping pong over the legislation. If the House of Lords go too far and actively block the bill or put amendments that the House of Lords can't agree to, then you have more of a crisis. And there the solution would be an early general election. Because if you have a situation where they block the bill, you could invoke the Parliament Act, but that's a process that takes a year. And Theresa May doesn't have a year to introduce the legislation again and then use the Parliament Act to say, well, it's been passed through the House of Commons twice, so we can make it law on the certificate of the Speaker. If I was Theresa May in that situation, what I would do is the Fixed Term Parliament Act says the next election will be 2020. Now there are some provisions in place to call a general election earlier than that, but they're difficult. One includes requiring a vote of no confidence in yourself, which would sort of almost be Theresa May writing Jeremy Corbyn's election campaign material for him. I don't think even he would miss that open goal, quite frankly. So what I would do, I would say, well, let's amend the Fixed Term Parliament Act and resolve this for a general election. And I'd say let's have the general election in February, and that would require the House of Lords to vote for the general election. If they do that, then the polls suggest that Theresa May will get an even larger majority. New Tory MPs chosen by Conservative Party constituency associations are likely to be harder Brexiteers. And so you have on these benches a majority for a harder Brexit, which I think is probably the very last thing that Miller and Dos Santos wanted to achieve. I think that the more likely thing is that the House of Lords won't go that far. The Article 50 bill will go through, but I think it will remain, the Miller case will remain of huge interest, perhaps not to David Davis, Secretary of State for Brexit, but to Liam Fox, Secretary of State for International Trade. Because what the case is really about is the role of the government and Parliament over conducting international treaties. And in a post-Brexit world, international treaties are going to be far more important. Because we are going to be conducting trade deals, or the intention is to conduct trade deals with many more countries. And so that situation, that legal relationship between Parliament and government on international trade deals is going to be critical. So that's why Miller is going to be of longer standing interest. That's not necessarily about the EU, because once the legislation's gone through, it's of no interest to David Davis. And I think I'll leave it there. I've gone on long enough. So. Are there any questions? I'm sure there are thousands, but...
I think, from what you're saying, it sounds like Miller and Santos, their goal is not to stop this thing. And I think it's probably in those financial backers they've got, in terms of around that trade goal at the end, that you could well be to shift the landscape for the final shape of Brexit, and certainly in relation to trade. It'd be really interesting to know who those financial backers are.
I know, so would I. I think so. I do know some.
This is a right gear.
I know one or two people who have funded it. They tended to be Liberal Democrats, or sort of people who were heavily involved in the Liberal Democrat. And certainly some of those funded it because they felt that they could go through and block Brexit. Now that position has of course shifted. But it does raise to me a very interesting thing, that the laws developed a situation where now it's being used as a tool to try and achieve political goals, but it's not very good at doing that, is my basic point. And that this is, and the other point is that Parliament is actually doing quite well at scrutinising government on Brexit already. In November, there were 25 select committee inquiries investigating the government on Brexit in various committees. And the government has already climbed down and said we're going to give some information to Parliament before invoking Article 50. So they're doing more than what the Supreme Court could ever offer Miller and Dos Santos.
This is a massive change in what's happened to this country's relationship with the rest of the world. And somebody does not want to let this opportunity pass them by, and they're going to use it, and it sounds like they're using this as a tool to do it, even though it's extremely blunt.
Yes.
Could I just say something? Perhaps the question to ask is not why Miller and Dos Santos presented the case, but why the government is actually appealing it. Because what will happen if there would have not been a Miller and Dos Santos case? That would mean that anybody can call a referendum, and that's essentially you abandon parliamentary democracy and you go straight away into direct democracy.
Well, I think
and that will have enormous implications for not just Britain, Britain and the relationship of Britain with the rest of the world too. So
yes, I think the only, in the UK constitutional system, the only person or the only institution that can call a referendum is Parliament. So
Yeah,
there's...
but if you have a majority in a parliament, that majority will call a referendum that suits that particular faction, will have a result. Essentially, you are creating a one-party state.
The concern is that you're sort of, we're dipping into the referendum well ever more frequently, and that has been an argument that sort of, we've had AV, Scottish independence, Brexit, we are using referendums far more frequently.
And that might have been the intention of Miller dos Santos, stopping that, making people to think about that.
Possibly. Certainly, I think after the debacle of the campaigns, I think referendums are going to be off the agenda for quite a long time, perhaps other than the Scottish independence.
If the case is
issue.
won by Miller dos Santos, because if it is lost, you will have more referendums, because the mechanism will have been proved to be successful.
I'm not overly sure. The sort of referendum in this country has been used by politicians as a tactical device to restore sort of, or try and get over divisions within the political parties. And it's sort of, I don't know if we'll end up with more referendums if this case is lost. I think the two issues are more separate, which I think is why it's sort of, I think the case is actually far narrower than it may first appear. And there's regard, what was you had another question?
No, it was essentially that, to say that for me the question is not why Miller dos Santos presented the case,
Yes.
but why it's being appealed, frankly, because
Yes.
it looks to me that, frankly, it seems to be that the government is going to lose it anyway. So why is appealing it? And it may not be just a way of...
Well, I think, if you're saying that Miller and dos Santos are using this for political purposes...
No, I don't think so.
Well, sort of, but, that's certainly my view. But if you think that, then the government are appealing for political purposes, because what this case has been a massive diversionary tactical way from forcing the government to spell out in more detail what Brexit means, what that really means. Because it's shifted the media focus away and has given the government a nice sort of diversion and a sort of excuse to say, well, we have a case that's before the Supreme Court, we're not going to spell out our position too much before then. It provided a nice sort of diversionary tactic. But I think if we didn't have the referendum, if we didn't have the Miller and dos Santos case, I think Parliament would be in the situation where we are now, where the government are making concessions to Parliament. They're making concessions about the information that will be provided before invoking Article 50. And David Davis has said before a committee of the House of Lords that Parliament will get exactly the same information, if not more, than the European Parliament will get, because they get information from the Commission. The government will give them the same level of information, if not more, to allow Parliament to scrutinise the government's negotiating position. David Davis said that in mid-October. And so sort of Parliament is sort of doing its job without the need for Miller and dos Santos and the Supreme Court to tell Parliament what to do. Because it's sort of, what the Supreme Court can say is, you need a bill. You need legislation. That's all it can say. It can't say any more than that. And what Parliament seems to have done is gone ahead and gone further already. So if a bill is passed, then it's passed. But it may be that the bill includes legal guarantees, but the legal guarantees that the government don't mind, because they've already politically made the concessions.
Would you say that this information you're talking about, does that possibly include information that perhaps should have been given to the electorate in the first place in order to be able to make a more informed decision? Or is it not that type of information?
I don't think it's that type of information. It's likely to be negotiating positions. You may say that the Leave campaign should have spelled out clearly what Leave meant. and require them to sort of spell out in detail what sort of relationship you should have, Britain will have with the EU or the EEA or whatever in the event of a leave vote. But that's not necessarily the sort of information that we're talking. It's going to be negotiating positions and views of negotiators, or sort of positions that they feel they may take, or representations they've had from maybe the City of London or other interested bodies that they're going to present and things. So, you had a question?
Sure. Two things. Following on from that, would you say that if the government, or indeed anyone wanted, I mean, the UK's been in the EU for 40 years. There was an incredible lack of education in school system or anywhere about the EU. So I don't think that the Leave campaign in a few brochures could educate the UK populace about the benefits and detriments, if you will, of being in the EU when the government has neglected in schools to teach anything. Would you agree? Is that reasonable?
Yeah, I think the issue is that knowledge of the EU is sort of extremely low. Yes, and the knowledge that there is sort of based on a media that sort of obsessed about straight bananas and all this sort of really weird bonkers elements of the EU, really focusing on okay, every institution has sort of very weird elements to it, but rather than focusing on the bulk of what the EU does. There's this ties into this idea that the EU is a massive expense and what have you, and it's and actually it's quite a lean. It's actually a relatively lean machine if you think about what it does in terms of its role in the governance of 500 million people. Its costs are far lower than the Westminster government and Whitehall and what have you. And it's doing it in a very different way, but it's actually quite cost effective for what it does.
So a secondary question, if following Brexit, do you think that other states can leave, like Denmark, the Netherlands, etc.?
I think that's the $1 million question, isn't it? I think it depends on what sort of deal the UK gets. I think if the UK gets what seemed to be a good deal, which I don't think is overly likely, then that may make leaving more attractive. It also depends on what happens to the euro. In the Italian banks there is sort of start from the Italian banking crisis, and Italy itself there's going to be a change of government in Italy, and so the plates are moving in Europe as well. So it may be that there develops a situation where there is a core group and an outer group, and sort of they have to sort of move to a more pragmatic situation, which is what they actually did with the negotiations that Cameron got. Actually, that was the start of a more pragmatic way of dealing with member states that didn't want to be part of the main sort of Eurozone group. In that sort of Cameron did get a sort of an exclusion from ever closer union, which is one of the guiding principles of the EU, and did get some restrictions on free movement of people, which had always been seen as sacrosanct. So there could have been the start of something there, but this referendum is new to all that. Any more questions?
You say you've been following it for quite a while. Was the sort of legal wrangling that we have now, was that foreseen before even the referendum and the campaign? People see that was going to be tricky to achieve, just plain leaving. And are there more in the future?
Well, I think people felt that untangling UK law from EU law was going to be complicated. And the idea of a Great Repeal Bill was sort of fairly well anticipated. What hasn't been anticipated was the Miller and Dos Santos litigation over invoking Article 50. The actual sort of birth of this litigation, I think, can be traced to some blogs written for the UK Constitutional Law Group by one's a barrister and a lecturer or reader at UCL, another is an Oxford associate professor, and another writer, and they sort of developed this interesting legal argument. It's a very interesting legal argument. They developed it and it's been taken on, put through the courts.
When did they develop?
They did that shortly after the referendum.
Right.
The issue of how you sort of divide or extricate UK law from EU law, that had been anticipated as being a legal nightmare, which is a sort of...
So we're not experiencing a legal nightmare at the moment. We're still waiting for...
Yes, in a nutshell. It's sort of the real legal fireworks are still to come, I think, with the Great Repeal Bill. Because that really is going to be legally intractable and complicated. We don't have many details about the Great Repeal Bill, other than it's going to try and convert all law that's sort of directly applicable and that is law in the UK by virtue of membership of the EU, and convert that into UK law, which that's easier said than done, to put it mildly. That requires going through 40 years of stuff, basically, and working out, is this still law? What do we do with this? Do we convert it? Do we leave it?
Is that politically quite neutral? Is it just a case of working your way through it, or is every stage of that going to have equal amount of prominence?
Well, I think there'll be a lot of it may be uncontroversial.
Right.
Because a lot of it is about standards and about things that we've broadly accepted. And it may be that there are bits we want to change, but we can change them in due course post-Brexit. There may be some things that are particularly controversial that we may want to look at whilst we're looking at it, so that on the date of Brexit we take a different position. One area might have been sort of workers' protection and various bits of employment law that Theresa May has made clear and did make clear at the Conservative Party conference that not a word of employment law would change under her government. So we sort of take that for what we will, but that sort of does indicate sort of that some controversial things will be left until after Brexit. I think Brexit is itself enough to be going on. I don't know, are there any more questions? Okay, well it's 2 o'clock, so time out really nicely. So thank you very much for coming.
Yeah.